Between 1971 and 1983, Hansen abducted women from the streets of Anchorage, flew them into the Alaskan wilderness in his private plane, hunted them through the forest with rifles and a bow, then buried their bodies beneath the snow. And for years, almost nobody believed the women who tried to warn people about him. In Anchorage, he was respected, a quiet baker, a husband, a father, the kind of man neighbors trusted. Every year, he won hunting trophies for tracking wild game through the Alaskan wilderness. That night, he landed the plane in a remote clearing miles from civilization. He cut her loose. Then he told her to run. Because this wasn't a kidnapping. It wasn't a robbery. Robert Hansen hunted women for sport. Her name was Cindy Paulson. She was 17 years old, and unlike the others taken into those woods, she escaped. Robert Christian Hansen was born on February 15, 1939 in Estherville, Iowa. His childhood was defined by a specific grinding kind of pain, the kind that does not come from dramatic trauma but from years of quiet humiliation. Hansen suffered from severe acne and a pronounced stutter throughout his school years. In the social hierarchy of a small American town in the 1950s, those two things were enough to place him firmly at the bottom. He was mocked relentlessly. He was excluded. Girls wanted nothing to do with him. The social world that his peers moved through freely was one he could never fully enter. He grew up furious about it, quietly, carefully, deeply furious. He found an outlet in hunting. In the forests and fields around Iowa, with a rifle or a bow in his hands, everything that humiliated him in the social world disappeared. Out there, he was skilled. Out there, he was in control. Out there, the rules that worked against him did not apply. Hunting gave him something that nothing else could, the feeling of absolute power over another living thing. In his early 20s, he was convicted of arson after burning down a school bus barn. He served a short sentence. Shortly after his release, he moved, eventually landing in Anchorage, Alaska in the 1960s, where he built what appeared to be a stable and respectable life. He opened a bakery. He married. He had children. He became known in the community as a serious and decorated hunter, winning competitions, earning trophies, building a reputation as one of the most skilled outdoorsmen in the region. He was hiding in plain sight. Alaska in the 1970s and early 1980s was a particular kind of place. The oil pipeline boom had brought thousands of workers flooding into Anchorage almost overnight, and with them, money, bars, and a red light district that grew quickly and largely without regulation. Women working in that world existed in a specific kind of vulnerability. They were often from somewhere else. They had few connections to the community. If they disappeared, the people around them frequently assumed they had simply moved on. Hansen understood this perfectly. He targeted women from Anchorage's bars and red light district, women he calculated would not be immediately believed if they reported him and would not be immediately searched for if they vanished. His process was methodical. He would approach women, sometimes paying for their company, sometimes simply offering a ride. He was not physically imposing. He was quiet and mild-mannered, the stutter that had humiliated him in childhood now working in his favor as a kind of disarming quality. He seemed harmless. Once he had a woman isolated in his car or later in his plane, he would restrain her, fly her deep into the Alaskan wilderness and release her with a head start. Then he would hunt her. He used the same weapons he used on his trophy animals, a Ruger Mini 114 rifle, a bow. He tracked his victims through the forest the way he had tracked deer and bear for 20 years. When he caught them, and he almost always caught them, he killed them and buried them in the snow. He kept a map, a private aviation map of the Alaskan wilderness on which he marked the burial sites of his victims with small crosses. He kept it hidden in the roof of his house, alongside a collection of jewelry taken from the women he had killed. Trophies, the same way he kept the heads of the animals he hunted. Robert Hansen was not unknown to police before his arrest. In 1971, he was accused of kidnapping and raping a woman in Anchorage. The case went to trial. Hansen's colleagues provided an alibi. The woman, a dancer working in one of Anchorage's clubs, was not believed. The charges were dropped. This happened again and again. Women reported him. Women described exactly what he did: the plane, the wilderness, the hunting. Police listened and then looked at Robert Hansen, a respected community member, award-winning hunter, local baker, family man, and chose the man over the women. Then, in June 1983, Cindy Paulson escaped. She was 17 years old. Hansen had abducted her at gunpoint, taken her to his home, and then driven her to the airport to put her on his plane. During a moment of distraction at the airport, she ran. She flagged down a truck driver on the highway and was taken to the police. She told them everything: the plane, the wilderness, the hunting, his name. They interviewed Hansen. He denied it calmly. His friends provided alibis again. Investigators initially accepted his story over hers. But two Alaska State troopers, Sergeant Glenn Floth and Trooper Lyle Hogsven, refused to let it go. They pushed. They built a case. They brought in FBI profiler Roy Hazelwood, who reviewed the evidence and told them clearly, "This man is your killer." A search warrant was obtained. Investigators searched Hansen's home. They found the map. They found the jewelry. The searches in the wilderness began. The recovery operation that followed Hansen's arrest is one of the most sobering chapters in Alaskan law enforcement history. Using the map recovered from Hansen's home, the aviation map with its small, careful crosses, investigators flew into the wilderness and began to dig. What they found in the snow and frozen ground confirmed everything Cindy Paulson and the other women had said. Body after body, each one buried with a cross on the map indicated. Each one a woman who had reported Hansen or simply disappeared without anyone connecting her absence to him. Some of the women recovered had been reported missing years earlier. Some had never been officially reported missing at all. The wilderness had kept its secrets for over a decade. Hansen eventually confessed to 17 murders. Investigators believed a true number was higher, possibly as many as 21 or more. The remote terrain made it impossible to find every burial site, and Hansen himself was not always forthcoming about locations. 17 confirmed victims over a decade in a state where the wilderness itself became an accomplice. The women Robert Hansen killed came from the margins of Anchorage society. Dancers, sex workers, women who had come to Alaska during the boom years looking for a different life. They were young. Most were in their 20s. Many were from other states, other places, people who had arrived in Anchorage with ambitions and found themselves in circumstances that made them vulnerable to exactly the kind of approach Hansen used. They reported him. Multiple women reported him. They described the plane, the wilderness, the hunting. They told their stories clearly and completely and were not believed because the system looked at them and then looked at Hansen and made a calculation about whose word was worth more. That calculation killed women. Every woman who reported Robert Hansen and was dismissed by investigators, every case that was not pursued, every alibi that was accepted without scrutiny represents a choice made by a system that valued his respectability over their lives. Some of the women recovered from the wilderness have never been fully identified. They remain in records as Jane Does, women whose names are unknown, whose families may never have known what happened to them, whose lives before that forest are lost. They deserved better, from the system that failed them, from the world that forgot them. Robert Hansen pleaded guilty in February 1984 to 4 counts of murder as part of a plea agreement. He provided information about burial sites in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. He was sentenced to 461 years plus life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was transferred to Spring Creek Correctional Center in Seward, Alaska, where he remained for the rest of his life. On August 21, 2014, Robert Hansen died in prison of natural causes. He was 75 years old. He outlived several of the investigators who caught him. He outlived several of the women who tried to report him and were not believed. He died in a prison bed, warm, after a long life that included decades of killing and decades of comfort that his victims never received. The map he kept, the careful, methodical record of everything he had done, is preserved as evidence, a document of what one man was capable of hiding behind the most ordinary life imaginable. There is one detail about the Robert Hansen case that I cannot move past. Women told the truth. Multiple women. They named him, they described his plane, his methods, his house. They gave investigators everything they needed, and they were not believed. Not because the evidence was weak, not because their stories were inconsistent, but because Robert Hansen had built something more powerful than evidence. He had built a reputation, a respectable life, a community standing that made the idea of him being a killer feel impossible to the people who knew him. He understood, perhaps better than any killer before him, that the most effective camouflage is not hiding. It is belonging, being known, being liked, being the kind of man that people instinctively defend when someone makes an accusation. The Alaskan wilderness hid his victims,